On a bright winter morning in Montana, a former Navy SEAL followed his silver-gray German Shepherd into the snow. What the dog found wasn't just a wounded man, but a military secret buried on purpose. Someone wanted it erased. Someone was already coming back to finish the job. In the coldest place he'd ever been, the SEAL had one choice: walk away or fight one last time. If you believe in loyalty, courage, and rescue stories that matter, subscribe now. This story is just beginning. Bozeman, Montana wore winter the way an old warrior wears medals: bright, heavy, and impossible to ignore. The morning sky was a hard, clean blue, and the sun spilled across the valley like a cold blessing, turning every rooftop and pine branch into white fire. Snow didn't just fall here. It settled in layers, sealing sidewalks, softening fences, and making the whole town look innocent, even when the wind snapped at ears and stung cheeks raw. Cars moved slow on the outer roads, tires crunching like someone chewing ice. Breath rose from people's mouths in small ghosts that vanished as quickly as promises. Beyond the last neat neighborhoods, the northern tree line stood like a dark wall, a boundary drawn by nature's blunt hand, and the forest looked calm only because it was patient. In a city like this, winter was not a mood, it was a law, bright enough to blind, cold enough to punish, beautiful enough to trick the foolish into thinking it was gentle. Jack Miller lived inside that contradiction. He moved through the morning with the measured economy of a man who had learned the hard way that wasted motion was a kind of debt. 35 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried his strength in quiet places, in the set of his jaw, in the way his weight stayed centered even on slick snow, in the stillness behind his eyes. His face was cut in clean angles, cheekbones like someone had carved them out of granite, a straight nose that had been broken once and healed a little crooked, and a mouth that rarely did anything careless like smile too early. A short, neat beard shadowed his jawline, trimmed close, as if he didn't trust anything that could be grabbed. His hair was dark brown, kept short, and the cold made it look almost black. The most striking thing about him was his gaze, gray, steady, and watchful, like a storm seen from far away. People in town sometimes guessed what he used to do, but Jack never confirmed it. He wasn't rude, just guarded, the way a man becomes after watching good intentions get people killed. There had been an event years back that made him this way, an operation overseas where a decision arrived 1 second too late, where he learned that heroism does not stop bullets and that the world rarely rewards sacrifice with anything more than silence. He came home with medals he didn't display and a habit of scanning rooftops even while buying coffee. Now he lived in Bozeman because the mountains didn't ask questions, and the snow, for all its cruelty, was honest. On this morning, he wore his Navy working uniform, NWU digital camouflage, the pattern continuous across the entire jacket, front placket, chest area, and pocket flaps, with absolutely no solid color panels anywhere. The uniform looked almost too real against the postcard whiteness of the park, as if a piece of another world had wandered into this one and refused to blend in. It wasn't a costume to him. It was armor of memory, a reminder of structure in a life he was still rebuilding. At the end of a leash walked the one creature who understood him without language, a German shepherd with a rare silver-gray coat, 4 years old, athletic and powerful, built for endurance rather than show. The dog's fur wasn't shiny in a polished way. It was dense and weather-ready, catching sunlight like frost on steel. Its ears stood tall and decisive, its muzzle strong, and its eyes, amber-brown, intelligent, alert, tracked the world with the calm authority of a creature that knew it belonged in it. The dog's name was Arrow, not because it was fast, though it was, but because it had a habit of pointing its whole being toward the truth of a moment. Arrow's temperament was steady, gentle around ordinary people, polite with children, almost comically unimpressed by squirrels, and fiercely tuned to Jack's slightest shift in posture. Arrow had been trained, yes, but beyond training there was something older in him, a loyalty that felt mythic, as if some ancient pact between warrior and wolf had simply chosen new names. The park they used was open and bright, a wide, flat field near the edge of town where the snow lay smooth except for footprints and the parallel grooves of cross-country skiers. Jack worked Arrow through simple drills: heel, sit, stay, then more complex ones, patterns of movement that looked like play to an outsider but were really a language, Jack giving commands, Arrow returning answers. Their breath steamed in the air. Their boots and paws left clean marks. Everything felt ordinary enough to pass for peace. And then, without warning, Arrow stopped. Not the casual pause of a distracted dog, not the stubborn freeze of an animal that had found a smell worth savoring. This was different. Arrow's whole body locked, ears lifting higher, shoulders tightening under the thick coat. The leash went taut in Jack's gloved hand as Arrow leaned forward, eyes fixed past the park's far fence, beyond the last row of bare-limbed trees, toward the darker forest that began where the town ended. A low sound rose from Arrow's throat, not a bark, not a growl, but a restrained, vibrating whine, the kind of signal Jack remembered from places where the air itself felt hostile. It was the noise a soldier's dog makes when it hears something the human cannot yet name. Jack's spine responded before his mind did. He didn't panic. Panic was loud and useless. Instead, he stilled, letting the world speak. The wind hissed across the field. Far away, a raven perched on a light pole, black against snow-white glare, watching like a judge with no patience for excuses. Jack followed Arrow's gaze and saw what Arrow saw. Nothing obvious. No person moving, no animal crossing, no snowmobile roaring by, just the tree line and the bright silence that sat on it like a mask. Jack loosened his grip on the leash just a fraction, enough to give Arrow space to read the air. Arrow's nose lifted. The dog took one careful step, then another, pulling Jack toward the fence line with a purpose that made Jack's stomach tighten. A woman walking a small dog on the path slowed when she noticed them. She was a minor figure in the morning's story. Mid-50s, bundled in a puffy coat, cheeks pink from cold, her knit hat pulled low, eyes curious but cautious. She offered a quick, polite nod, the kind locals gave when they didn't want to intrude. Jack nodded back without stopping. The woman didn't recognize him, and he preferred it that way. Arrow, however, did not spare her a glance. His attention was nailed to the north. Jack's boots crunched toward the fence. The sunlight was so bright it made the snow sparkle like shattered glass. He could feel the cold crawling under his collar, trying to find skin, but he ignored it. Arrow reached the fence line and sniffed along the base where snow piled in small drifts. He circled once, twice, then paused at a gap where the lower rail had been warped by weather and time. Arrow pressed his nose close and inhaled sharply. The whine returned, higher now, urgent. Jack crouched, fingers brushing the snow. Beneath the top layer, the surface had been disturbed recently, not by playful kids, not by skiers. The marks were narrow, deliberate, and oddly spaced. Jack leaned closer. The snow's crust had been broken, then lightly covered again, as if someone had tried to erase their passage but didn't have time to do it well. Arrow pawed once, careful, restrained, then looked back at Jack, eyes bright with insistence. That look wasn't fear. It was warning mixed with certainty, like a messenger saying, "You need to see this." Jack's heart thudded once, heavy, like a door closing. He slid his glove off and pressed two bare fingers into the indentation. The cold bit immediately, sharp as teeth, but it also told him something. The snow here hadn't fully refrozen. The track was fresh. He shifted his gaze along the line of marks leading away from the fence and into the scrub brush toward the woods. The tracks didn't look like a deer's cloven prints, and they didn't look like the wide, confident stamp of a man in hiking boots. They were too long in places, too shallow in others, as if the maker had moved with unusual weight distribution, sometimes sinking, sometimes barely touching, as if sliding, limping, or being dragged. Jack's mind offered possibilities, each worse than the last, and he hated that part of himself that still calculated danger like it was math. Arrow gave another small sound, then angled his body toward the northern trees, pulling again. Jack stood, replaced his glove, and tightened his hold on the leash, not to stop Arrow but to steady the pace. He scanned the open field behind them. A few people continued their morning routines, unaware that anything had changed. Cars moved along the distant road. The sky remained bright and indifferent. The town's calm felt suddenly staged, like a painted backdrop meant to lull someone into a mistake. Jack looked back to Arrow. The dog's posture was not frantic, it was focused. This wasn't curiosity. This was duty. Jack exhaled slowly, feeling the old rhythm returning, the quiet inside the chaos, the moment when a man chooses to step forward because stepping back would haunt him more. He followed the line of tracks to the very edge of the park, where the neat world ended and the wild began. The forest waited, dark and still, like the mouth of a legend. Jack's boots crossed the last patch of open snow, and Arrow led him toward the first trees. Just before the branches swallowed the light, Jack paused one final time and looked down at the strange marks cutting into the whiteness. He had seen footprints all his life, footprints of enemies, footprints of friends, footprints of people running toward help and people running away from it. These were different. These looked like something trying to move like a human, or something human trying to move like something else. He tightened the leash, felt Arrow's strength surge forward, and stepped into the shadow line. Behind them, Bozeman kept sparkling. Ahead, the track slipped deeper into the woods, and the story began to whisper its first threat. Whatever made those prints did not want to be found, and it was close enough that Arrow could taste it in the air. Jack followed the tracks into the forest without looking back. The light changed the moment the first line of trees swallowed him. Snow still lay thick on the ground, but here it reflected less sky and more shadow, turning the white into something harder, almost metallic. Sunlight filtered through tall pines in clean, blinding columns, sharp enough to make the air feel brittle. Every sound carried, the snap of a twig, the slow sigh of wind moving through branches, the steady rhythm of his own breath inside the collar of his uniform. This part of the forest was not chaotic. It was orderly in an ancient way, as if every tree knew its place and every silence served a purpose. Jack had walked landscapes like this before, half a world away, where beauty and danger learned to coexist without apology. Arrow moved ahead of him, leash loose now, body low but confident. The German shepherd's silver-gray coat stood out starkly against the snow, his muscles rolling smoothly beneath thick fur. He moved with the certainty of a creature that trusted the ground beneath his paws, yet his ears flicked constantly, tracking sounds Jack could not hear. Arrow was 4 years old, but there was an old soul in him, sharpened by training and something deeper than training, an instinct that had once saved Jack's life in a place where maps were useless and promises meant nothing. Jack let the dog lead, watching the way Arrow's nose traced the air, the way his tail held steady rather than wagging. This wasn't excitement. This was work. The tracks grew clearer as they moved deeper. Whatever had made them had not bothered to hide well once inside the tree line. Jack knelt again, studying the impressions. In places, the snow was compressed unevenly, as if the person, or thing, had shifted weight suddenly. There were drag marks now, thin lines cutting through powder. Jack felt the old, unwelcome tightening in his chest. This was no casual hike gone wrong. This was flight. Arrow stopped abruptly near a cluster of fallen branches half buried in snow. He barked once, sharp and loud, the sound cracking through the stillness like a gunshot. Then he began to dig. Snow flew in controlled bursts as his front paws worked with urgency but precision. Jack crouched beside him, scanning the surrounding trees. His hand instinctively moved to where a weapon should have been. There was nothing there, only cold air and memory. Arrow's digging slowed, then stopped. He lowered his head and nudged something with his nose. Jack reached in and brushed away the remaining snow, fingers closing around cold metal. He lifted it into the light. It was a military dog tag, or what was left of one. Bent nearly in half, edges worn smooth, the chain broken. Jack turned it over carefully. The surface was scratched, deliberately marred, but not enough to erase everything. A fragment of an insignia remained, faint but unmistakable. Jack's jaw tightened. He knew that symbol. It belonged to a special operations unit that officially no longer existed, a unit that had been dissolved after a mission that went catastrophically wrong years ago. A mission Jack had read about in classified reports and heard whispered about in barracks late at night. Men from that unit didn't simply disappear. They were reassigned, buried in paperwork, or in some cases, buried in foreign soil. But this meant someone had been here recently, someone tied to a past that powerful people preferred to keep sealed. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, though Arrow hadn't moved. The dog's eyes were fixed on the shadows ahead, his body tense again. Jack slipped the bent tag into his jacket pocket. The metal felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than its own weight. He stood slowly, listening. The forest answered with silence, but it was not empty silence. It was the kind that pressed in, alert and watchful. Jack's mind began assembling pieces he didn't want to fit together. A hidden trail, a damaged military identifier, tracks suggesting injury, someone running or being moved through terrain that punished mistakes quickly. This wasn't an accident, this was pursuit. Arrow suddenly growled low in his throat, not at the ground, but at the sky. Jack followed his gaze upward through the lattice of branches. At first, he heard nothing. Then, faintly, almost lost in the wind, came a sound that did not belong to the forest. A deep, distant thump, 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 slow and rhythmic. Jack froze. It was far away, but unmistakable. Rotor wash. A helicopter. He tilted his head, narrowing his eyes, listening for the subtle details that separated civilian from military. The sound was too controlled, too steady. Not a tourist chopper, not medical evacuation. And yet, when Jack instinctively checked the small civilian tracking app on his phone, the screen showed nothing. No aircraft, no emergency alerts. The signal bars flickered uncertainly, as if the forest itself were interfering. Arrow let out a sharp bark, then fell silent again, ears pinned forward. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Whoever was out there wasn't broadcasting their presence. That meant they didn't want to be seen. Jack stepped behind a thick pine trunk, pulling Arrow close. He lowered himself, scanning the sky through gaps in the branches. The sound grew louder for a moment, then faded, as if the aircraft had changed direction or altitude. Snow drifted lazily from disturbed branches high above, catching sunlight as it fell. The helicopter never appeared. Jack exhaled slowly, forcing his breathing to remain calm. This was bad. Very bad. He was standing in a forest near his quiet Montana town, holding evidence tied to a dead unit, while an unregistered aircraft moved somewhere overhead, and he had no intention of pretending he hadn't seen any of it. Arrow nudged his knee, then turned back toward the trail, clearly expecting Jack to follow. The dog trusted his instincts, and Jack trusted the dog. That trust had been forged in gunfire and dust, in nights when sleep came in fragments and dawn arrived with bad news. Jack adjusted his grip on the leash and moved forward again, deeper into the woods, where the tracks narrowed and began to wind uphill. His mind raced, but his body stayed steady. He cataloged details automatically: wind direction, visibility, possible approaches. Somewhere ahead, someone was bleeding, hiding, or already too weak to run. And somewhere above or beyond, someone else was watching. Jack didn't know yet which role he was about to play: rescuer, witness, or target. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. The past he thought he had left behind had just sent him a signal, loud enough to echo through snow and silence alike. And it was not finished with him. He paused once more, glancing back through the trees toward the town he could no longer see. Bozeman might have been bright and peaceful under the winter sun, but that peace had edges now, sharp ones. Jack looked down at Arrow, whose silver-gray coat gleamed softly even in shadow. The dog met his gaze, steady and ready. Together they moved on as the distant sky swallowed the last trace of the helicopter's sound, leaving behind only the promise of something unseen and very much alive. The forest opened suddenly, as if it had decided to tell a secret. Jack and Arrow emerged from between the trees onto the rim of a shallow ravine where sunlight poured in unbroken, turning the snow into a blinding sheet of white. The air felt sharper here, cleaner, and the wind moved freely, carrying the dry scent of pine and cold stone. The slope fell away at a gentle angle, dotted with half-buried rocks and scrub frozen into brittle shapes. It looked peaceful in the way dangerous places often do, bright enough to lull the mind, quiet enough to hide what shouldn't be seen. Arrow slowed, his gait changing, paws landing more carefully as if the ground itself had begun to speak a different language. His silver-gray coat glowed against the snow, every muscle alert beneath the thick fur. Jack followed at a measured distance, eyes scanning the open space, instincts humming low and constant. This kind of terrain was a trap for the careless. Visibility was wide, but cover was scarce. If someone was watching, they would have a clear view. Arrow stopped near a small drift at the base of a rock outcrop. He sniffed once, sharply, then barked, short, urgent, nothing playful in it. Jack felt his pulse jump. He moved quickly, dropping to one knee beside the dog. At first, Jack saw nothing unusual, just wind-shaped snow piled against stone. Then the snow shifted. A shape broke the perfect surface, skin pale and raw against white. A hand. It protruded at an unnatural angle, fingers stiff and slightly curled, the nails rimmed with ice. For a split second, Jack's mind rejected it as a trick of light. Then training took over. He lunged forward, digging with both hands, ignoring the cold biting into his fingers through the gloves. Snow flew aside as he worked fast, deliberate. Arrow joined him instinctively, paws carving space with careful urgency, as if he understood exactly what was at stake. The body emerged piece by piece, an arm, a shoulder, a torso. Wrapped in dark fabric soaked stiff with old blood, the man was alive. Barely. Jack pressed 2 fingers to the side of the man's neck and found a pulse, weak, irregular, but there. Relief flashed through him, quickly replaced by focus. The man was in his late 30s or early 40s, tall, even collapsed, with a lean, weather-hardened build. His face was angular, sharp-boned, with a day's worth of dark stubble frosting over with ice. His lips were blue, cracked, trembling faintly as air rasped in and out. Dark hair, cut short in a military style, lay plastered to his forehead with sweat frozen in place. His jacket was heavy-duty, not civilian outdoor gear, but not standard issue either, as if it had been chosen to avoid notice. On the chest, Jack saw what made his stomach drop, a patch area where fabric had been scraped raw. The insignia that should have been there was gone, deliberately removed, the threads torn out with something sharp. Blood had dried around it in a dark, ugly bloom. Jack swore under his breath. Hypothermia, blood loss, possible internal injuries. The man shouldn't have survived the night, let alone the storm. Jack stripped off his own outer layer without hesitation and draped it over the man's torso, then pressed his hands to the man's chest, trying to share warmth. Arrow leaned in close, his body a living wall against the wind, breath puffing steadily. The dog's presence wasn't just comfort, it was heat, and Jack used it without shame. The man's eyelids fluttered. His gaze struggled to focus, pupils blown wide. When he finally found Jack's face, there was a flicker of recognition, or maybe fear. His mouth opened and a sound scraped its way out, barely a whisper, carried away by the cold before it fully formed. Jack leaned closer, ear near the man's lips. "Easy," Jack said quietly, his voice low and steady, the tone he used when everything depended on calm. "You're safe. I've got you." The man's cracked lips moved again, his breath hitched. Don't trust." The sentence broke apart as a spasm of pain rippled through his body. Jack held him still, anchoring him to the moment. "Don't trust who?" Jack pressed, knowing time was thin and truth even thinner. The man's eyes rolled, then snapped back, suddenly sharp with desperate clarity. He swallowed hard, as if forcing the words past something that wanted to choke them. "Don't trust anyone in the city." The sentence ended there. His body went slack, consciousness slipping away like heat into snow. Jack felt the weight of those words settle on him, heavy and unwelcome. Anyone in the city. That wasn't paranoia spoken by a man half frozen and delirious. It was a warning shaped by experience. Jack checked the man's breathing again, then began assessing injuries more thoroughly. There was a deep gash along the man's side, crudely bandaged with torn fabric, already frozen through. His left leg lay at an odd angle, possibly fractured. Jack worked quickly, methodically, splinting what he could with branches in his own gear. Arrow stayed close, occasionally lifting his head to scan the tree line, ears pivoting like antennae. The forest felt too quiet again. As Jack lifted the man's jacket to check for additional wounds, something caught his eye. Just below the collarbone, partially hidden by grime and blood, was a tattoo. Jack froze. He brushed snow and dried blood away carefully, heart beginning to hammer. The tattoo was old, the ink slightly faded, but unmistakable. It was the same symbol as the fragment on the bent dog tag Arrow had uncovered earlier. The same unit, the same erased history. Jack's jaw clenched hard enough to ache. This wasn't coincidence. This man wasn't just connected to the past Jack recognized. He was part of it, part of something that had been deliberately dismantled and buried. Jack looked down at the unconscious man, at the deliberate scars and the erased insignia, and felt a familiar anger rise. Cold, controlled, dangerous. He had thought his life in Bozeman was a quiet one, a chance to build something small and honest. But the past had followed him here, bleeding and half dead beneath fresh snow. Arrow nudged Jack's arm, then looked toward the ravine's edge, where the tracks continued faintly uphill. The dog didn't need to be told what this meant. Whoever had left this man here might still be close. Jack adjusted the man's position, bracing him against the rock to block the wind as best he could. He pulled out his phone again, checking for signal. It flickered weakly, bars dancing and disappearing. No help, not yet. Jack met Arrow's gaze, the silent understanding between them as clear as spoken words. They couldn't stay exposed. They couldn't leave him either. Jack's eyes returned to the tattoo on the man's chest, memorizing its lines, its meaning. The warning echoed in his head, sharper now. Don't trust anyone in the city. Jack exhaled slowly, steadying himself. The snow around them sparkled in the sunlight, beautiful and indifferent. Beneath it lay a man who should have been dead and a truth that refused to stay buried. Jack pulled his jacket tighter around the stranger and positioned himself between the ravine and the open slope, scanning for movement. Somewhere above, somewhere unseen, a decision was being made. And Jack knew, with a clarity that settled deep in his bones, that once this man woke again, nothing in Bozeman would ever be simple. Bozeman welcomed them back with the same bright, snow-polished calm it always wore, as if nothing in the forest had ever reached out to touch it. The roads were clear enough for winter, sunlight bouncing off plowed banks and shop windows, the mountains standing blue and patient in the distance. Jack drove with one hand steady on the wheel. The other braced against the back seat where the unconscious man lay wrapped in layers of jackets and blankets. Arrow sat upright beside him, silver gray head high, eyes locked on the road ahead. The dog's posture was rigid, protective, a quiet warning that followed them all the way into town. The local hospital rose from the snow like a clean white promise, modern, well-lit, glass and steel catching the morning light. It looked safe. That was the problem. Inside, warmth rushed to meet them, thick and almost dizzying after the cold. The smell of disinfectant and coffee filled the air, and the hum of ordinary life moved through the corridors. Phones ringing, carts rolling, voices low and efficient. Jack carried the man in himself, ignoring the sting in his shoulders, and set him gently onto a gurney as staff rushed forward. One of them was a woman Jack noticed immediately, not because she was loud or commanding, but because she moved with a kind of grounded focus that cut through chaos. Her name badge read, Sarah Whitman, RN. Sarah was in her early 40s. Tall and lean, with auburn hair pulled back into a practical knot that had loosened just enough to frame her face. Her skin was pale, freckled lightly across the bridge of her nose, and her eyes were a calm green that missed nothing. She had the posture of someone who had learned to stay upright through long nights and bad news, shoulders squared but not tense. There was kindness in her expression, but it was the kind that had been tested by loss and decided to remain anyway. As she took in the man's condition, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Recognition, not surprise. Hypothermia, possible trauma, she said, voice clear and steady. Let's get him inside now. Arrow followed the gurney until Jack stopped him at the threshold. The dog planted his feet, muscles coiling, a low growl vibrating in his chest as another nurse approached with gloved hands. This nurse was younger, shorter, dark-haired, her movements quick but slightly hesitant. She froze when Arrow's gaze snapped to her, amber eyes sharp and assessing. "It's okay," Jack said quietly, his tone firm without being harsh. "He won't bite. He just doesn't like strangers near him." Sarah glanced at Arrow, then at Jack, reading the situation in a heartbeat. "We'll work around him," she said, "but we need space to treat the patient." Arrow's growl softened but didn't disappear. Jack knelt, resting a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady heat beneath thick fur. "Stay," he murmured. Arrow stayed, but his eyes never left the door. The man was wheeled away, swallowed by swinging doors. Jack stood there for a moment, hands empty now, the weight of responsibility shifting rather than lifting. Sarah returned a few minutes later, pulling off her gloves. "We'll do everything we can," she said. "He's alive because someone found him when they did." Her gaze lingered on Jack's uniform, the continuous digital camouflage pattern unmistakable. She didn't comment on it, but something in her eyes sharpened, as if she were filing that detail away for later. Jack nodded, thanked her, and moved to the waiting area with Arrow. The hospital lobby was bright and open, sunlight streaming through high windows. People sat scrolling phones, sipping coffee, worrying about ordinary things. It felt wrong, like a stage set built too close to a battlefield. Arrow refused to lie down. He paced instead, positioning himself directly in front of the treatment doors, body angled to block anyone who came too close. A few minutes later, Sarah returned with a clipboard. "We need some information," she said. Name, age, anything you know. Jack hesitated. He gave what he could, where he found the man, his condition, the lack of identification. Sarah's pen paused. No ID? None that I could find, Jack said carefully. Sarah nodded, then stepped away to input the data. Jack watched her disappear behind a glass wall into the nurse's station. Something tugged at his attention, not a sound, but a feeling. The old itch between his shoulders. He pulled out his phone, more out of habit than expectation, and checked the time. Then he noticed the monitor mounted on the wall across the room, displaying patient updates in a scrolling list. A new entry appeared. Unidentified male, hypothermia, trauma. Then, almost immediately, the entry flickered. Jack frowned. He stood, moving closer. The line updated again, the timestamp changing. A field he hadn't seen before appeared, then vanished. He glanced toward the nurse's station. Sarah was at a terminal now, her brow furrowed. She typed, stopped, then typed again, faster. Jack approached, keeping his voice low. Something wrong? Sarah looked up, eyes sharp. That's odd, she said. His file just updated itself. Updated how? Administrative notes, she replied. I didn't enter them. She turned the screen slightly so Jack could see. The cursor blinked in a field that should have been locked. A moment later, text appeared, then erased itself. Sarah exhaled slowly, a habit formed from too many long shifts. We have systems glitches sometimes, she said, but the words didn't quite convince her. Jack watched the screen, the memory of the warning echoing in his head. Don't trust anyone in the city. Arrow's growl deepened, barely audible, his attention fixed on the hallway beyond the station. A man in a maintenance uniform passed by, pushing a cart. He was average height, mid-50s, gray beard trimmed short, eyes downcast beneath a knit cap. Nothing remarkable, except the way he glanced up just long enough to meet Jack's gaze, then looked away too quickly. Jack filed the detail away. Sarah cleared her throat. I'll keep an eye on the chart, she said. You should sit. This might take a while. Jack nodded but didn't move. He positioned himself where he could see both the treatment area doors and the main corridor. Minutes passed, then more. The hospital continued its quiet rhythm, and then, without warning, everything stopped. The lights flickered once, twice, and went out. Darkness fell hard and complete, swallowing the lobby, the corridors, the nurse's station. The hum of machines died, replaced by the sharp intake of startled breaths. Somewhere an alarm began to wail, cut off abruptly. In the sudden black, Arrow lunged forward, barking once, loud and furious. Jack moved on instinct, stepping toward the treatment doors, hand outstretched. Emergency lights snapped on seconds later, bathing the hospital in red. Staff voices rose in confusion. Sarah appeared from the darkness, face pale but composed. Power outage, she said. Backup should... She stopped mid-sentence, eyes going past Jack toward the treatment area. The doors were open. Too open. Jack felt his stomach drop. He pushed forward, Arrow at his side, heart pounding. Inside, the room was empty. The bed stood stripped of its occupant, monitors disconnected, sheets discarded. The man was gone. Jack stood there in the red-lit silence, the weight of the truth settling in his chest. Someone had used those few seconds of darkness perfectly, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The suburb looked harmless in the winter sun, almost tender. Snow rested on rooftops in clean, sloping layers, and icicles glittered along gutters like fragile ornaments. Streets were quiet, softened by the cold, the kind of neighborhood where people waved politely and locked their doors without thinking too hard about why. Jack moved through it with Arrow at his side, boots crunching softly, breath steady. The German shepherd's silver-gray coat caught the light with every step, a living contrast against the white lawns and pale fences. To anyone watching, they would have looked like a man walking his dog, nothing more. Jack knew better. The feeling had followed him since the hospital, the sense of eyes where none should be, of space tightening just enough to matter. Arrow knew it too. The dog's ears kept flicking back and forth, not in confusion, but in calculation, as if he were counting something Jack couldn't see. Jack's house sat at the edge of the neighborhood, modest and practical, its driveway half buried under snow. He didn't go straight inside. He slowed instead, letting Arrow lead just enough to read the air. Arrow paused near the mailbox, nostrils flaring, then glanced toward the far end of the street where a dark SUV idled, engine running, windows tinted too deeply for a quiet residential road. The vehicle hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. Jack didn't stare. He shifted his weight casually, pretending to check his phone, but his mind was already mapping angles, distances, lines of sight. Arrow let out a soft, warning huff and positioned himself slightly ahead of Jack, body angled protectively. The SUV rolled forward an inch, then stopped. Jack continued walking, heart rate unchanged, posture relaxed. When he reached his front door, Arrow froze. His tail went rigid, his head lifting, eyes locked on the roof across the street. Jack felt it then, sharp and unmistakable, the wrongness in the air. He didn't look up immediately. He took one step back instead, letting the shadow of the porch overhang swallow him. A heartbeat later, something cracked through the silence, a sound so faint it might have been a branch snapping under snow. Arrow barked once, explosive and urgent, lunging sideways and slamming his shoulder into Jack's leg. The shot followed, a dull, suppressed thump, and snow erupted from the porch railing where Jack's head had been a second earlier. Wood splintered. Jack hit the ground hard, rolling instinctively. Arrow pressed against him, a wall of muscle and fur. Jack's breath came fast for exactly one count, then slowed as training took over. He crawled behind the porch support, dragging Arrow with him. The world narrowed to angles and probabilities. He didn't need to see the shooter to know there was one. Arrow's warning had been perfect, timed to the fraction of a second. Jack peered through a gap in the railing and finally looked up. Across the street, on the roof of a two-story house, a figure lay prone against the snow. The man was dressed in winter whites, his outline nearly erased by the glare. He moved with the economical precision Jack recognized immediately. This wasn't a panicked criminal. This was someone who had learned to breathe through a scope, someone who had practiced patience until it became instinct. Jack felt a familiar cold anger settle into his chest. The shooter shifted, adjusting position. Jack grabbed Arrow's collar and whispered, "Stay." Arrow stayed, muscles quivering, eyes fixed on the roof. Jack broke cover and sprinted along the side of the house, snow kicking up behind him. Another suppressed shot cracked, missing him by inches. Jack reached the corner and vaulted the low fence into his backyard, then cut through to the next yard, using sheds and trees for cover. By the time he circled back toward the street, the roof was empty. The SUV was gone. Only the shattered quiet remained. Jack stood still, listening, heart pounding now, not from fear but from the weight of confirmation. This was real. Someone had tried to kill him in broad daylight, in a quiet suburb, with neighbors close enough to hear nothing and see even less. Arrow trotted back to him, unhurt, eyes bright and focused. Jack knelt and checked him anyway, hands running over the dog's body, searching for blood or pain. There was none. Arrow licked Jack's chin once, a brief grounding gesture, then turned back toward the street, alert again. Jack exhaled slowly. He knew what this meant. This wasn't about the man taken from the hospital alone. This was about containment, about cleaning up loose ends. Jack went inside, locking doors, closing blinds, but he didn't pretend walls would protect him. He moved through the house methodically, checking windows, noting sightlines. Arrow followed, silent and watchful. Jack's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, half expecting nothing. Instead, a new message sat there, number unknown. He didn't open it yet. He waited, listening to the house settle, to the distant sound of a snowplow somewhere far off. Then he opened the message. "Your dog is next." The words were plain, unadorned, cruel in their simplicity. Jack's jaw clenched. He looked down at Arrow, who met his gaze without fear. The threat wasn't bluster. It was strategy, and it told Jack everything he needed to know. The people hunting him understood exactly where his weakness lived. The forest looked different in full daylight, stripped of the mystery that shadows like to borrow at dawn and dusk. Snow lay clean and reflective beneath tall pines, and the sky above was a hard, unbroken blue that made every sound feel exposed. Jack returned the way he had come days earlier, following memory rather than tracks, with Arrow moving just ahead, silver-gray coat bright against the white ground. The dog's pace was deliberate, not hurried, as if he understood the weight of what they were about to confirm. Jack carried less gear than he would have liked and more resolve than he could afford. The anonymous threat still sat like a stone in his pocket, and the knowledge that someone had walked into a hospital and erased a man without consequence had burned away any illusion of safety. Here, at least, the forest didn't pretend to be kind. It simply was. Arrow slowed near a familiar stand of trees, the same cluster where the tracks had first narrowed and twisted uphill. He sniffed the air, then veered left, away from the obvious path, toward a low drift pressed against a rocky slope. Jack followed, eyes narrowing. The snow here was oddly smooth, less wind-scoured than the surrounding patches, as if it had been piled and shaped by hands rather than weather. Arrow pawed once, twice, then stopped and looked back at Jack with a calm insistence that needed no words. Jack knelt and brushed away the top layer. Beneath it, a seam appeared, straight, unnatural. He dug with his gloves, uncovering a metal edge dulled by frost. A hatch. Jack's pulse steadied. He had seen this kind of work before, overseas and stateside, built to disappear into terrain until someone who knew where to look came calling. He cleared the latch and tested it gently. It resisted, then yielded with a muted groan that seemed too loud in the quiet. Arrow angled his body between Jack and the opening, ears pricked, eyes sharp. Jack lifted the hatch and peered into the darkness below. A ladder descended into a narrow chamber, its rungs rimmed with ice. Cold air breathed up from the opening, stale and metallic. Jack slid down first, boots finding purchase, one hand steady on the ladder, the other bracing the hatch above until Arrow followed with controlled grace. The chamber was small, reinforced with corrugated steel panels, insulated and intentionally ugly. A single worklight hung from a hook, dead now, its cord chewed by cold or time. Jack switched on his flashlight and swept the beam across the space. Crates lined the far wall, some stamped with serial numbers that had been scratched out, others marked with innocuous labels that fooled no one who knew logistics. A folding table stood in the center, littered with binders and a laptop sealed in a rugged case. Jack moved slowly, cataloging. Arrow sniffed the perimeter, then sat near the ladder, guarding it with a quiet vigilance. Jack opened the nearest crate. Inside were documents wrapped in plastic, operational briefs, after-action reports, personnel rosters. Names leapt out at him, some crossed through with thick black ink, others circled in red. He felt the truth take shape with sickening clarity. This wasn't a rogue operation gone wrong and buried out of embarrassment. This was a campaign of erasure. Survivors identified, tracked, removed. A second crate held equipment, comms devices with their identifiers filed down, uniforms altered to look civilian, winter gear designed to blend into snowfields just like the shooter on Jack Street. Jack closed the crate and moved to the table. He opened a binder and found a familiar symbol stamped faintly on the inner cover. The same unit mark as the bent tag, the same as the tattoo on the man's chest. The pages detailed timelines, locations, and outcomes written in the dry language of bureaucracy. But the margins told another story. Notes scrawled by someone who knew the cost, who had circled dates and written confirmed beside names that had gone dark. Jack's jaw tightened. He opened the laptop. The battery was dead, but a thumb drive lay taped beneath the keyboard. He pocketed it without hesitation. Arrow shifted, head lifting, nostrils flaring. Jack paused, listening. For a moment, there was only the low whisper of wind through the hatch above. Then he heard it. A footstep, distant but deliberate, crunching snow that tried and failed to hide its intent. Then another, from a different direction. Jack's eyes met Arrow's. The dog rose silently, moving to Jack's side. Jack killed his flashlight and stood still, counting breaths. The steps multiplied, circling. Someone had found the place, or followed them to it. Jack made a decision that came as naturally as breathing. He secured the hatch from below as best he could, leaving it closed but not sealed, then positioned himself beside the ladder, Arrow angled slightly forward, ready. He wasn't going to flee and leave the truth behind, not again. The footsteps drew closer, spreading, careful now. Jack could picture them without seeing them. Men trained to move as a team, to communicate without words, to trust the plan even when the plan demanded cruelty. He felt anger, yes, but beneath it was something steadier, purpose. The truth beneath the snow wasn't just evidence, it was a line drawn. Jack tightened his grip on the ladder rung and listened as the sound of boots crept nearer from more than one side, the forest closing its ring. The forest exploded into brightness the moment Jack burst from the hatch, snow flaring white around him as if the ground itself had been struck by lightning. Daylight flooded everything, No shadows to hide in, no darkness to forgive mistakes. Pine trunks stood like pillars of glassed stone, their branches sagging under clean weight, and the sky above was a ruthless blue that made every movement visible from a distance. Jack moved anyway, because stopping meant surrender. Arrow surged beside him, silver-gray coat flashing, paws biting into crusted snow with a speed that came from trust rather than fear. The ring of footsteps he had heard below had broken into motion above, men fanning out, boots crunching in practiced intervals, voices absent because words were unnecessary. These weren't amateurs. They were hunters who knew how to let the environment do half the work. Jack ran diagonally, not straight, cutting across a slope to force angles and buy seconds. Arrow veered ahead, then doubled back, circling in a way Jack recognized instantly. The dog was reading lines of sight and scent at the same time, building a moving map. Arrow's ears snapped toward a rise on the left. Jack shifted without looking, dropping to a knee behind a fallen log just as a shot cracked the air and snow burst apart where his head had been. The sound was sharp and clean, unsuppressed this time, meant to end it quickly. Jack exhaled once, steadying, and moved again before the echo finished dying. They crossed into a stand of younger trees where the snow lay shallower and the ground pitched unevenly. Arrow darted right, then left, not fleeing so much as shaping pursuit. Jack followed, counting breaths, muscles burning in the cold. He reached a low ridge and slid down the far side on purpose, letting gravity carry him fast into a shallow basin where sunlight pooled so bright it hurt. Arrow disappeared for a heartbeat and then reappeared at Jack's flank, teeth bared, eyes blazing, not at a man but at space. Jack trusted that signal. He rolled, felt a round tear past, heard it slap wood. He came up behind a tree, heart hammering now, not with panic, but with the old, terrible clarity of engagement. He had seconds, no more. Jack pulled the thumb drive from his pocket, hands numb but precise, and jammed it into his phone. The screen flickered. A progress bar crawled. Arrow pressed against his leg, a living shield, then sprang away, barking once and sprinting down slope. The sound drew fire like a magnet. 2 shots chased the silver flash. Jack flinched but didn't move. Arrow's gamble bought him time. The upload ticked forward. Jack forced his breathing slow, eyes scanning for movement through the glare. He saw one of them then, a man breaking cover at the edge of the basin, tall and spare, beard trimmed close, eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses that reflected nothing but snow. The man moved with a disciplined economy that spoke of years of drills and one event that had hardened him into something colder. He raised his rifle without hurry. Jack shoved off the tree and ran. Arrow reappeared out of nowhere, slamming into the man's legs with a force that knocked him sideways. Snow flew. The rifle clattered. The man hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up empty-handed, surprise flickering across his face before discipline snapped it away. Arrow snapped and feinted, not to maim but to control, hurting the man backward toward a cluster of saplings. Jack skidded to a stop, heart in his throat, and saw another hunter crest the ridge, shorter, heavier, cheeks red with cold, jaw clenched as if anger were the only warmth he had left. This one carried himself differently, shoulders tight, movements aggressive. He had learned violence fast and young, and it had taught him to rush. "Arrow!" Jack shouted, voice tearing through the open air. The dog broke contact instantly, veering uphill, drawing the second man's attention just long enough for Jack to sprint across the basin and dive behind a boulder. Snow exploded as rounds struck stone. The phone vibrated in Jack's pocket. Upload complete. He didn't stop to celebrate. He climbed, fingers scraping, lungs burning, Arrow rejoining him on the ascent with a sound that was half bark, half laugh. They reached the crest together and dropped into a narrow corridor where wind had scoured the ground bare, ice shining like glass. Jack nearly fell. Arrow steadied him with a shoulder check, then bounded ahead, leading them into a maze of fallen timber where straight shots were impossible. They moved like that for minutes that felt like hours. Advance, misdirect, vanish. Arrow would appear in one place, bark, vanish. Jack would break the other way, leaving tracks that turned suddenly into nothing. The hunters adapted, spreading wider, cutting off angles. Jack felt the net tightening. He ducked behind a spruce and felt a hot, slicing pain along his arm, wood splintering, a graze that burned but didn't slow him. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. Arrow skidded to a stop beside him, sides heaving, a thin line of blood at the edge of one paw where ice had cut deep. Jack's chest tightened. He pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's, the contact grounding them both. Almost, he whispered, not knowing whether he meant escape or endurance. They burst back into open light at the far edge of the forest, a slope rolling down toward a frozen meadow that gleamed like a mirror. Jack knew this place, wind always strong, sound carrying. He sprinted anyway. A figure rose ahead, blocking their path. A woman this time, tall and rangy, hair cut short beneath a hood, eyes steady and assessing. She held her rifle low, fingers straight along the guard, posture calm. There was no hatred in her face, only resolve shaped by orders followed too long to question. For a heartbeat, the world balanced. Arrow lunged left, Jack dove right. The shot came from behind them, a thunderclap that tore the air open. Sound collapsed into a single violent note. Snow leapt. Someone cried out, or maybe it was the wind. Jack hit the ground hard, rolling, Arrow colliding with him, both of them tangled in white. The meadow rang with echoes, then went eerily quiet. Jack lay still, breath shallow, listening for the next sound that would decide everything. Morning returned to Bozeman like a promise kept. Snow lay fresh and unbroken on rooftops and sidewalks, reflecting sunlight so clean it felt almost ceremonial, as if the city itself had decided to begin again. The mountains stood clear against the sky, their ridgelines sharp and honest, and the air carried that rare winter stillness that makes every sound feel earned. Jack woke to that light filtering through his window, pale gold on white, and for the first time in days, his chest did not tighten with the need to count exits. Arrow lay at the foot of the bed, silver-gray fur catching the sun, eyes open and calm, watching the world return to order without quite believing it would stay that way. The events of the night before pressed in quietly. Sirens at a distance, radios crackling, men in uniforms that were not his moving with a purpose he recognized but no longer answered to. The shot in the meadow had not taken him or Arrow. It had taken something else instead, secrecy. When Jack rose, he moved carefully, testing the ache along his arm, the bruises that spoke of impact rather than defeat. Arrow stood with him, stretching, a thin bandage wrapped neatly around one paw where ice had cut deep. The dog bore it with stoic patience, tail giving one small, satisfied sweep against the floor. By mid-morning, the city had begun to hum. Snowplows worked the outer roads, and neighbors emerged with shovels and coffee cups, exchanging nods that said more than words. Jack stepped outside with Arrow at his side, boots crunching softly, and felt the eyes on him, not suspicious now, but curious, relieved. News traveled quickly in a town this size. People knew something had happened. They didn't know the shape of it, and Jack was grateful. Truth, when released, didn't always need a narrator. Sometimes it needed only to be free. His phone buzzed once, then again. Messages stacked up, some from numbers he didn't recognize, others from people he did. One name made him pause. Sarah Whitman. He answered. They met near the hospital, where the glass facade mirrored the snow-bright street. Sarah looked different in daylight, without the fluorescent glare and the tension of alarms. She wore a long wool coat over scrubs, auburn hair loose now, catching the sun in copper threads. Her posture was still squared, still ready, but there was a softness at the edges that spoke of exhaustion, earned and survived. She greeted Arrow first, crouching to his level, letting him sniff her gloved hand. "You did good," she said quietly, and Arrow accepted the praise with dignified restraint. Sarah straightened and met Jack's eyes. "He's alive," she said simply. The words landed with a weight Jack hadn't known he was carrying. She explained in measured terms how the man had been found during the confusion, how systems corrected themselves when sunlight and oversight returned, how the truth Jack sent out had reached people who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen it. The witness would live. More than that, he would speak. Sarah's expression held relief tempered by resolve. She had seen too much to believe in happy endings without work. "They're dismantling it," she said, quietly but thoroughly. Jack nodded. He didn't ask who they were. Names were less important than outcomes. Later, at the edge of town where the forest began, Jack walked with Arrow beneath trees that glittered like chandeliers. The hatch in the snow was gone now, the ground restored by hands that worked with care rather than concealment. What had been buried was no longer his burden alone. He felt the strange lightness of that realization, the way a man feels when he sets down a pack he's been carrying so long he forgot it was there. He did not consider returning to the Navy. That chapter had closed the moment he chose truth over silence in a meadow full of light. Instead, he chose something smaller and somehow larger. He chose to stay. Days followed in a rhythm that felt earned. Jack fixed a fence for a neighbor whose hands shook from age rather than fear. He walked Arrow through parks and along trails where children laughed and threw snowballs that fell short. Arrow's coat shone under the winter sun, a living ribbon of silver against white, and people stopped to admire him, to ask questions Jack answered with a half-smile. At night, Jack sat by the window with a mug warming his hands, watching snow drift down in soft, deliberate spirals. He slept better than he had in years, not because danger had vanished, but because it had been named and answered. One afternoon, Sarah stopped by with a box of bandages and a loaf of bread wrapped in paper. She stayed for coffee. They spoke of ordinary things: weather, work, the quiet heroism of routine. She had a scar on her forearm, thin and pale, the legacy of a night when she chose to run toward rather than away from danger. Jack noticed it and didn't ask. Respect, he had learned, was sometimes best expressed by silence. When she left, she paused at the door and looked back. "You know," she said, "cities like this survive because someone decides to stand where the forest meets the street." Jack watched her go, understanding settling into place. The winter deepened, then eased. Snow fell and melted and fell again. Life continued its stubborn work. The witness spoke and the network collapsed in the way rotten structures do, quietly at first, then all at once. There were no parades, there were no medals. Jack preferred it that way. He had become what he needed to be, a presence rather than a symbol. A man who noticed when a car idled too long, when a trail went quiet for the wrong reason. Arrow remained at his side, ever alert, ever gentle, a guardian with amber eyes and a patience that felt older than the town itself. On a morning much like the first, bright, cold, honest, Jack and Arrow stood at the edge of the park and watched snow fall through sunlight. Arrow leaned into Jack's leg, content but ready, tail slow and sure. Jack rested a hand on the dog's neck and felt the steady thrum of life beneath fur and skin. The city breathed around them, unaware and safe in that unawareness. Jack did not mistake peace for permanence. He understood its cost now. When snow fell again, when the light sharpened and the forest whispered, he would listen. He would answer. An Arrow would run beside him, silver in the sun, calm as faith, ready as ever. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they walk quietly beside us, on four paws, or in the form of a choice to do what is right when no one is watching. In a world that often feels cold and confusing, God still works through loyalty, courage, and love. Through a man who refuses to look away. Through a dog who listens before danger speaks. Through truth that survives even when buried beneath snow. This story is a reminder that we are never truly alone. That even in our darkest winters, God sends light, sometimes through people, sometimes through animals, sometimes through small acts of faith that change everything. As you return to your own life today, may you remember that kindness still matters, that truth still has power, and that miracles often begin with one brave step forward. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to support more stories of faith, loyalty, and redemption. May God bless you, may He protect you and your loved ones, and may His peace walk with you, now and always.